Just give me one piece of evidence. Those were the words of a young teenager who came up to me during a break on a Saturday evening. I was doing 2 lessons back to back. He went on to share with me that he wasn't going to be able to stay for the second lesson. He had to work the night shift that evening. He said, "Can you give me just one piece of evidence that I can take back to my biology class?" Now, folks who know me know that me speaking for 5 or 10 minutes about topics like Christian evidences, apologetics, that's kind of a joke. In fact, it's been said that I can't even get my name out in 5 minutes. So the challenge was before me. I asked this young man, I said, "Are you familiar with the geologic column?" And he was. You may recognize all of those different striatal layers of the Grand Canyon, all the different beautiful colors. In fact, this young man went on to reveal the fact that he had memorized many of the layers and the years assigned to them. Things like the Carboniferous period, the Triassic period, the Cretaceous period. I asked him one question. I said, "What would happen, scientifically speaking, if we found fossils that transcended through 3 or 4 of those different layers? For instance, what if we found a fossilized tree that went through several different layers?" He smiled. He said, "It shouldn't happen." I said, "You're absolutely right, and yet it has on just about every continent." He realized the very existence of these fossils causes a whole lot of problem for the geologic column. I then shared with him the fact that realistically, the only place you're going to find that geologic column is in the textbooks. We spent just a moment discussing circular reasoning. The idea that, let's say we go out and we find a dinosaur bone, maybe out in your back pasture. Evolutionists have already presupposed that that dinosaur bone was roughly 65 million years old. So the layer of dirt that it's discovered in, guess what that automatically gets layered as, or labeled as? 65 million years. Any other bone that is then found in that layer, guess what it automatically gets labeled as? You see, we're dating the bones according to the layer we find them in, then we turn right around and we date the layer according to the bones that we find in it. It's circular reasoning. I then shared with him an ongoing experiment that I was aware about just outside of Mount St. Helens, Spirit Lake. A fellow by the name of Dr. Steve Austin is recording how quickly the Mount St. Helens area is recovering. Part of his research actually is taking place in that lake where many, many trees were washed down when the volcano exploded. He has documented the fact that those logs would sit up on top of the water many, many months, become water saturated, until finally the heavy root end would slowly start to settle down. They would bob standing upright on the surface of the water for many, many weeks before finally settling down into the bottom of the lake. And they would settle standing straight up. In fact, he said as it was swimming around the bottom of Spirit Lake, it looked like a forest. You see, Steve Austin has documented the fact that these trees are standing upright, the sediment is slowly filtering out according to its weight in all these different layers, and yet what he's documenting right now is what we find on continents all across this globe. We call them polystrate fossils. We found them literally everywhere. These are fossils that transcend through several different striatal layers, fossils that are going through solid rock, fossilized trees, fossilized whales. The question is, how did they get there? You know, it's one thing for evolutionists to simply say they don't exist, or that they are a figment of our imagination. Folks, the reality of it is we have polystrate fossils all over the place that do some serious damage to that geologic column. For instance, Bob Jones' Earth Science book stated, in Germany, France, the British Isles, Nova Scotia, California, several eastern states, fossils that extend through several layers of sedimentary rock have been found. These are called polystrate fossils. Now, an obvious question would be, why aren't government schools teaching this scientific fact? Well, ask yourself this question. What is the one thing that evolutionists need lots of? Time. You see, the geologic column builds in millions and millions of years. Do you honestly think that they're ready just to give it up? That they're ready to show kids, hey, look, we've got scientific evidence that disproves this. They're not ready to give up that much time. In fact, there's a teacher's edition of a science book where they say, stress that the earth is thought to be at least 4.5 billion years old. Now my question would be, why are we stressing that? Because folks, without billions of years, evolution cannot physically even get off the ground. What I want to do during our time together is I want us to look at the age of the earth, some of the arguments that are often used, and I want us to start all the way back with that Big Bang. That's where our young people are usually taught. A lot of times their science textbooks will start with the origins, with that Big Bang explosion. Ironically, though, in their textbook, it never tells where that matter came from. It starts literally mid-bang, so to speak. I had a youth minister in Nashville ask me one time, he said, Brad, could God have used a Big Bang to get us to where we are today? I appreciated his honesty. He was sincerely looking for an answer. Before I answer that question, I want us to take a minute and look at the science side of the Big Bang. Because in all reality, it's miserable science. What our children see is a picture of this cosmologic explosion, and they're told that within roughly 3.4 seconds, everything radiated out into space, and that space itself expanded. Sounds great. Sounds just like a nice little storybook. Folks, the only problem is, right off the bat, it violates two very fundamental laws of science. You've created matter, and you've gone from a chaotic explosion to an ordered universe. You know, my 7-year-old is smart enough to realize there's a problem with that. We were driving around in the car one day. My middle son, he said, Dad, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? I thought, hey, he's getting it. He said, it's kind of dumb to think that you can get an ordered universe from an explosion. I said, you're absolutely right. I said, can you imagine what would happen if we took a stick of dynamite and we put that in your bedroom and we blew it up? He laughed. He said, it probably wouldn't look any different, would it, Dad? Folks, at age 7, he doesn't know about the laws of thermodynamics. But he is smart enough to realize there's a problem with that. How do evolutionists get around these scientific laws in order to purport their Big Bang? I want a fellow by the name of Paul Davies, an evolutionist, to give you his answer. In a book called The Edge of Infinity, he said the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. I would ask the question, why is that more scientific than saying, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth? You see, folks, when you really start to analyze the data, the Big Bang Theory is miserable science. Let me give you a couple of examples. We could spend literally hours looking at it, but just a couple for you to think about. For instance, Jupiter. Jupiter is far, far too hot for there have been a Big Bang 18 to 20 billion years ago. The reason I say that is it is still giving off twice as much heat as it's receiving from our sun, telling us it's still in the cooling off phase. Folks, if the Big Bang happened 18 to 20 billion years ago, it should have long cooled off by now. And yet we have photographic evidence from NASA of volcanic eruptions on the moons around Jupiter. We know, for instance, that Ganymede, one of the moons that's encircling that planet, it has a strong magnetic field. Now, folks, anytime you have a magnetic field, that lets us know it's generated by liquid molten metal inside. It hasn't cooled off yet. We also know the Big Bang violates another scientific law known as the conservation of angular momentum. Conservation of angular momentum, if I were to describe it to you the easiest way, if you can picture in your mind for just a moment, putting my children on a merry-go-round. Let's say we're standing there. You know, sadly, they don't make merry-go-rounds much anymore, thanks to lawsuits, but I think most of you know what I'm talking about. We spin that thing just as fast as we can. Eventually, if we're fast enough, my children are going to come flying off that merry-go-round. Now, they may come flying off at different points because they weigh different weights, but when they fly off of that merry-go-round, they're going to be moving in the same direction. That's this law of conservation of angular momentum. Simply put, if you have a central axis that everything is coming out of, then it should be rotating in the same direction. Maybe you can picture in your mind a spiral galaxy. So folks, if there really was just a single Big Bang explosion, we would expect the heavenly bodies to all be moving in the same direction. Now, would there be an occasional exception to that? Maybe something that had bumped into another cosmic body? Absolutely. But folks, bear in mind, within our own solar system, we've got Venus, Uranus, and possibly Pluto that are rotating backwards from the other planets. 6 out of the 63 moons here in our own solar system, they're going backwards. In fact, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, they've got moons going in both directions. Folks, you wouldn't expect that from a Big Bang explosion. We could look a little closer to home at our moon. There used to be an argument that creationists would use, talking about the moon dust. It's not used very much anymore because scientists have come back and they've reanalyzed the numbers. Those of you who remember the lunar landing, you remember they had those big pads on the feet because they expected when that lunar lander finally landed on the moon that it was going to sink down. And in fact, those of you who really know your history, you remember Neil Armstrong had to jump down the last step. That ladder was 18 inches too short. They expected it to be compensated by the dust. Dust because the moon had been out in space collecting all this dust for millions of years, and yet there wasn't that much dust on the moon. But even if we throw out the whole moon dust argument, we know today, scientifically speaking, that the moon is retreating from the Earth at a constant rate every single year. It's just a small fraction. You don't need to stress about it tonight. But again, think with me for a moment. Scientifically speaking, we know that the moon is regressing. If this Earth were 4.6 billion years old, folks, where does that start the moon? You see the problem? Folks, it would have to start way over here, pass through the Earth to the other side. You know, there's another more logical explanation, and that is that maybe things aren't as old as folks would have us believe. Another problem with the Big Bang is the fact that they are dependent on two elements that we have never truly seen or measured. Allow me to explain that to you. Right now, the universe is expanding in such a way that astronomers have looked at and they can't figure what's holding it all together. So they've come up with two things: dark energy and cold dark matter. And according to them, 96% of our universe is composed of these two elements: dark energy, cold dark matter. Only 4% is composed of the physical bodies, the stars, the planets, the moons. 96%. And yet, folks, we have never truly measured or observed either one of those two. Now, I say that to say this: it takes a lot more faith to believe that right there than it does the one true living God. Just a couple of short years ago, Bob Berman, an astronomer, was writing in the Journal of Astronomy to his fellow colleagues. And in his article, he suggested that a warning be placed before every scientific article that discussed this Big Bang cosmology. I want you to listen very carefully to what his warning was. He said, "Warning, the following contains contemporary cosmology. Reading it can produce disorientation and confusion. Nobody knows what's going on, and nothing you read here is likely to be true." Now compare that with how we present it today in textbooks. as a fact. Let's get back to that question for just a moment. Could God have used a big bang to get us to where we are today? You know, friends, all we really need are the first two verses of God's Word to answer that question. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. If you have your Bibles, you might open there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. How does Moses describe the earth on that very first day? Well, ask yourself this question. What was the Spirit of God moving over? It was the waters. Now think. According to evolutionists, that Big Bang explosion, it took place at a temperature you and I can't even fathom. It was in the millions of degrees. How do you go from a 1,000,000-degree explosion to having a water-covered heavenly body on the same day? Folks, the heat should have dried that water up instantaneously. We know what the boiling point of water is, do we not? You add to that the fact the Bible records the sun, the moon, the stars. What day did they come into the picture? Day 4. So, is there any way that we can squeeze the Big Bang into God's creation account? Absolutely not. Not without a whole lot of compromise. And somebody says, now wait a second. Maybe each one of those days wasn't really a day. Maybe each one of those days of creation was really millions and millions or billions of years. I'll go along with you for just a moment. Let's open our Bibles and see if we can discern exactly what Moses had in mind. For instance, in Genesis chapter 1, if you look in verse 5, verse 8, verse 13, verse 19, we find Moses recording over and over the same phrase. He says, so evening and morning were the first day. So evening and morning were the second day. God here, he's putting a punctuation at the end of his creative activities. Moses, through inspiration, is saying not only are these days, he's defining it as an evening and a morning, and he gives it a number. Day 1, day 2, day 3. But he doesn't stop there. In fact, look at what he says in verse 14 of that same chapter. God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs and season, for days and for years. Friends, if each one of these was not a 24-hour day as you and I recognize it, but rather millions of years, what, pray tell, is he talking about here when he specifically references days and years? He even mentions seasons. And somebody says, well, wait a second, Brad. You can't say they measure time the same way because the Bible says very clearly that the sun wasn't in place until day 4. How could we record time? And folks, while we think about sunrise and sunset as a marking of time, actually a day is recorded as a revolution of what body? The earth. Day 1, God created the heavens and the earth. Is it possible that that spin was already in place on day 1? Absolutely it is. So could we record time? Absolutely we can. You know, if you think about it for just a moment, all you really need is just a little bit of common sense. You want to know how long these days were? Ask yourself this question. When were the green flowering plants put into place? Well, let's see. We flip open our Bible. We look at Genesis chapter 1, starting about verse 9, and we find out it was day 3. God created all of the green flowering plants on day 3. All right? Let's assume for just a moment, hypothetically speaking, that each one of these days is 1,000,000 years. What do those green flowering plants need in order to survive? Obviously, they got to have sunlight. Sun would be coming on day 4. We'll say for whatever reason they were able to make that leap. We know there was an evening and a morning. Of course, if each day was 1,000,000 years, that means you've got 500,000 years of evening, 500,000 years of morning. But we're not going to worry about that. We know they had water. Water was here on day 1. What else do they need? They got to have the right atmosphere, got to have nutrients in the soil. They also have to be pollinated, don't they? You know those little flying insects that drive us crazy? Bees. They actually serve a purpose, don't they? They pollinate the plants, allowing them to reproduce. Now think. Those plants are dependent on pollination from flying insects. The flying insects, what day did they come into the picture? Let's see. All flying creatures and water dwellers came into the picture on day 5. Are you really ready to take the position that God placed all of the green flowering plants here on day 3, and we had to wait 2 million years before they could be pollinated? Folks, that's illogical. Horrible thinking. You know, it's a whole lot easier to simply take Moses at his word. If you look in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, we find the 10 Commandments are being handed down in that particular chapter. In verse 11, he says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is." What does that leave out? And you keep that verse in mind, and you flip on over to Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31, starting in about verse 14, it talks about keeping the Sabbath. It says, "Work should be done," verse 15, "for 6 days, but the 7th is Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death." You skip on down to verse 17, it tells you why. It says, "It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." Now think about that for just a moment. What was the punishment for somebody working on the 7th day? It was death. Do you honestly think 2 Israelites were standing around going, "Well, let's see, I think I'm supposed to work 6 long eons of time and rest 1 eon of time"? Or do you think they knew, I'm to work 6 days, be off on the 7th, just like God did? You see, folks, when you really start to critically evaluate the evidence, you recognize over and over and again, this book outlines that it was 6 24-hour days. The New Testament writers refer back to that. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. Paul here, writing to the Christians at Rome, he says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen, being perceived by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." He says the invisible attributes of God have been seen since the creation of the world. Now, folks, if that's the case, somebody had to be here to do the seeing and the perceiving. Tells me man was here. Tells me this earth isn't billions of years old, with man being a relatively latecomer or newcomer. Mark chapter 10, verse 6, Jesus Christ speaking, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." Question: how in the world can this earth be 4.6 billion years old? Us only be around for 3 million years, and yet Jesus said, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." You see, the more you start to analyze this book, the more you recognize the fact that, folks, all of the evidence is pointing us in one direction. In fact, there's only one place in all of Scripture that indicates God took time, he stretched it out longer than what you and I would call a 24-hour day. That's in the book of Joshua. You remember the long day of Joshua. In fact, in Joshua chapter 10, verse 14, it says there hasn't been a day like that before or after it. Somebody says, wait a second. I know somewhere in my Bible it says a day to God is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years like a day. You're absolutely right. In the book of 2 Peter, it talks about that. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, I believe. And as you're looking at that particular piece of text, one thing that I would point out to you is keep it in context. Here we find the writer of this book talking about God's promise of coming back, Jesus Christ coming again. He's not talking about creation. So how can we lift this piece of Scripture, drop it into the creation count, and say, oh, day to God's 1,000 years a day? Folks, first off, that would only buy you 6,000 years during the creation week. Second off, you have taken something completely out of context and tried to drop it in the creation week. That doesn't work. I'm here to tell you, it is time we get our children, our grandchildren, out of the valley of doubt. We can do that by showing them the truth. Let me give you an example. Magnets. You know, most of us have them on our kitchen refrigerator. We know a couple of things about magnets. We know, for instance, that magnets lose their strength over time. We know the Earth has a magnetic field. In fact, if you hold a compass, it's going to point towards magnetic north. We also know the Earth has lost 6% of its magnetism in the last 150 years. Scientific fact, you cannot refute it. Now, folks, if that's the case, and it is, that begs the question, how in the world can somebody say this Earth is billions of years old? We wouldn't have any magnetism left. Second, it begs the question, how in the world can somebody support radiocarbon dating or radiometric dating that is dependent on uniformity when we know magnetism is decreasing over time? We can look at other scientific evidence like the Sahara Desert. You know, the Sahara Desert is growing roughly a foot every single year. It's a process called desertification. We can physically look on maps and we can see the past extent of the Sahara Desert. We can see where it is today. We can even see the direction that it's moving. But folks, again, these are observable laws of science. This is something we can measure. We can extrapolate back and ask the question, how old is the Sahara Desert? The answer is less than about 4,000 years old. And you say, okay, 4,000 years old, what's the big deal? Question, what happened roughly 4,000 years ago that put all of our weather patterns into place? Was that flood. See, time and time again, as you look out into nature, you start seeing example after example of evidence that points towards a young Earth. Let's look at a couple more. For instance, textbook. Student's textbook says the Mississippi River deposits sediment at a rate of 80,000 tons an hour. Now, I give you this example because I think it shows two things. Number one, I think it gives great evidence for a young Earth, but number two, it also shows part of the problem with our educational system today. You know, we're living under the no child left behind era. I would say everybody's been left behind, but that's for another time. Look very carefully at what's going on. Our children are growing up being conditioned for standardized testing. In fact, I would argue with you, I think many children have forgotten how to think critically. They never learn how to learn. Instead, what they do is they absorb trivia and get ready for tests. So, our child looks at this school page, it says Mississippi River deposits sediment at a rate of 80,000 tons an hour. What does he remember? He remembers Mississippi River, 80,000 tons an hour. He's ready for his test. But he never stops to think critically. 80,000 tons of sediment per hour? Folks, think about that. There again, we're talking about observable science, not speculation or hypothesis. We're talking about something we measure. You know what we see? It's right, 80,000 tons an hour. Which begs the question, folks, if this Earth was 4.6 billion years old, how much further should the delta stretch out into the Gulf of Mexico? The answer is there would be no Gulf of Mexico. It should have long filled in by now. Now, while we're talking about that Gulf, you know the salt water in the Gulf? We know the oceans today are 3.6% salt water. We know how the salt gets there. We know about the water cycle. The water evaporates up. Clouds move over land. The rains come down, picks up salt minerals from the land, deposits them in the oceans. 3.6% salt water. Again, here we go, folks. Observable science. 3.6% salt water. Do you realize we could have gone from fresh water to salt water in less than 5,000 years? Telling me, number one, this Earth isn't billions of years old, or else the oceans would be far too salty to sustain life. But number two, it also goes on and tells me a little bit about how life could have survived. The ocean fishes could have survived around the flood because it wasn't as salty back then. More like what you and I would call brackish water. We see evidence under our feet in those great oil reserves. You know, I'm from Tennessee, don't know a whole lot about oil. I've traveled and spoke quite a bit extensively in the Texas area. I have learned one thing that I'll share with you, and that is never place your finger over an oil cap. The reason being, Some of the oil is held underground at pressures of roughly 20,000 pounds per square inch. 20,000. Your car tires are probably inflated roughly to about 35 psi. This is 20,000. It would literally take your finger off of your hand. But there again, we've got to start thinking critically. We've got to ask ourselves, how long can limestone or sedimentary rock hold pressures like that underground? And again, the answer is less than 10,000 years. You see, time and time again, you keep coming back. When you start looking at observable things on this planet, it points you to a young Earth. I'll give you one more example. What about natural gas, oil? How did they get here? I want to read to you a textbook. Here's what they say. They said oil and gas are from organisms that once lived in the sea, that they were changed by heat and pressure, changed into oil. Okay? They would add heat, pressure, and millions of years, by the way. Do we know that a lot of this stuff comes from organic material that's been covered over, put under heat and pressure? Absolutely. But is there another possibility of how all of this stuff could have gotten covered over? Like, for instance, maybe a global flood? Absolutely. We can look at ice cores. Evolutionists like to use ice core dating to try to prove an ancient Earth. And the idea is every single winter you've got a white band, represents the snowfall, and then a clear band that represents a summer melt. And they basically add them up just like we would rings on a tree. The only problem with that is, not too long ago, there was an airplane that was discovered roughly 75 meters down. It was an old warplane. A warplane that they knew exactly when that plane had landed on that particular ice field. Now, think with me for just a moment. They take an ice core sample down. In fact, they eventually brought that whole plane up to the surface, and it actually flies in air shows today. But according to that ice core, according to the depth of ice, that plane landed hundreds upon hundreds of years ago. Folks, planes haven't been flying that long. Or we could look at population statistics as another great example of how we know this Earth is young. And we've been doing the census long enough to know the population doubles every roughly 35 years, including diseases, famines, etc., wars. Every 35 years. Now, we can extrapolate backwards and use that same information to try to figure out when was there a period of time when there wasn't as many people. You do the math, you come up with a date of somewhere in the 4,500 range. You say 4,500 years. I thought most creationists believe this Earth is roughly 6,000 years old. Yes, but what happened roughly 4,500 years ago that knocked us back to just 8? Folks, the numbers don't lie. You see, the more that you critically evaluate the evidence, the more you realize this Earth is not billions of years old. In fact, it was created in 6 literal days. I want to revisit Paul's statement to the Romans. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been clearly seen, being perceived by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. Notice what he says at the end, so that they are without excuse. There are a lot of people on this planet who are banking on an excuse of ignorance on the day of judgment. They basically have already said, well, you know what, if there's a God, I'm just going to tell him I didn't know. And yet Paul is ripping that excuse out from underneath them. He is saying you can know there's a God. His invisible attributes are all around you. I encourage you, get outside, look for those attributes, examine the evidence. Because the more you look, the more it's going to be pointing towards him.